As explained in the previous chapter, the whole reason for this language existing is to express visual ideas. This is the most important component of a painting, and it is the first place to look if your work isn't doing what you want it to do. Every decision made in the work should have some purpose in contributing to this main idea, and if it isn't, then it is probably distracting from it. Compare the early work of any musician, movie director, or other kind of artist to their later and more mature work. The common theme is that the work will be tighter, with every element serving a purpose. It can be helpful to think of finishing a painting as gradually adjusting relationships between contrasting elements so that they are in the right proportions to communicate your idea. When this is true, both adding or subtracting an element weakens the idea. The entire language works based on contrast. But what is contrast? It is the comparison of two things, showing a relationship between them. These relationships can be compressed, or expressed in varying degrees of simplicity, depending on how much information your medium can convey, or how much information your viewer can perceive. For example, charcoal can convey much less information than oil paint, which can convey a smaller range of information than digital painting. To compensate for these different ranges that different mediums allow, the information must be compressed differently. There are perceptual limits as well, such as the extremes of detail that we can even perceive. Every relationship can be compressed. The relationship between light versus dark, detail versus simplicity, warm versus cool, straight versus curved, even narrative relationships. With simple, compressed groups of information, we can then easily design with them. When the design then communicates the original idea, the visual language is serving its purpose. Compression is often the missing link that is not commonly discussed, but it is a key component to being able to express what we want in any medium. Compression is also a big part of how stylization occurs, and it offers a ton of room for creativity and personality, since there is no one correct way to do it. In this example by Vasily Polonov, I have compressed the relationships very heavily, both in terms of value and of shape. Try zooming out in paintings to see the larger relationships. Values, angles, colors, any relationship can be compressed. Compression takes a wide range of information, and through grouping, conveys the same relationships using less information. Once those areas are grouped, the contrasting differences between them can be shown in various ratios, conveying different feelings. So far, the mechanics of this language are not specific to painting. Music works entirely based on relationships, and specifically relative relationships. If we are talking about volume, then how much louder or softer is one note compared to the previous one? With pitch, it is the intervals that are important, not the exact absolute pitches. This is just like in painting, where the important thing is not what the actual values are, but the distance between them. This is true for every element of painting. This could easily be applied to countless other artistic disciplines. In science, there is the concept of the theory of everything. If a theory is so specific that it has a number of exceptions, and it applies to this situation here, but not this one over there without modification, then there is most likely something wrong with the theory. The explanations that stand the test of time are elegant in their simplicity. This is very helpful for artists because, again, we want the ideas to dictate the means of communication and not the other way around. Now on to the actual elements specific to painting. As mentioned, the ocean of the language of painting is not that wide, but it is extremely deep. There are only 4 elements, and they are all dependent on each other, and therefore can be expressed as a pyramid. Drawing is the foundation of this pyramid. Drawing, as defined here, is not about any specific medium, but about expressing relationships. You can draw with a pencil, a paintbrush, or with a handful of mud. If you can express relationships visually, then it is drawing. Thinking this way really helps you to remember what it is you are actually doing, composing. This leads to another new definition. Composition is composing, and composition is baked into every step of the process. Just like writing music by deciding on the relationships between notes is composing. So far, the new definitions that we've explored have been for drawing, the expression of relationships, composition, decision-making about relationships, and regarding realism, that there is no such thing as realism versus abstraction. The language is always abstract, but sometimes representational. When we paint and represent real objects, they're in reality an abstract illusion and serve as an excuse for contrast to design with. It might now be obvious to you why drawing is at the bottom of the pyramid, with every other element dependent on it. As the expression of relationships, it is the minimum that you need in order to express ideas visually. As such, it has the most possibilities of things to compare and contrast, and it is also the element that is deepest and closest to being a lifelong journey of improvement with no end. The contrasts you can show with drawing are infinite, such as big versus small, simple versus complex, straight versus curved, and anything else you can imagine. The first and most fundamental contrast in drawing is between the conceptual and the optical. This was discussed earlier as having most schools entirely weighted in teaching one direction or the other, as if one of these ways of approaching drawing was more correct than the other. They are in reality two parts of the same whole. We see as if we had vision with different layers, like the different data layers on Google Maps. Our sight information is layered with touch information. We see an optical image, but this can't be entirely divorced from what we know about something. What we know about something also can't entirely be divorced from how it appears to us. When we learn something new, it even then makes it possible to see it. If you've studied anatomy and then learned a new muscle or a new word and then start seeing it everywhere, that is the same phenomenon. The conceptual is what we know about a subject, and the optical is purely what we see. Again, they are related, and this is one of the major defining points of style. They are simply different ways to explore and communicate our perception, and one is not more important than the other, just as our sense of touch is not any more or less important than our sense of sight. Books that teach perspective and construction are weighted towards the conceptual end, while sight-based ateliers are towards the other, but they are exploring parts of the same thing. Let's start with a simple cylinder. Here we are starting with conceptual information. We can think about where the horizon line is, and even draw through the cylinder to see how the entire form relates to the ground plane. This is all objective information about the cylinder, not really related to our sense of sight. Then we can think about the direction of the light source, and if we think about the major differences in value that this creates, we can apply shadow shape information, compressing optically into just two values. We could have also started with these shapes, and rather just thought about the form of the cylinder in our heads. It's not about what process you use, but what principles you are thinking about. Lines are very good for showing conceptual information. These lines show where the cylinder ends and where the background begins. However, line is not exclusively for this purpose. In reality, there is no difference between lines and areas of visual tone. Lines could easily just be showing part of a dark background. Let's add a dark shape behind the cylinder, which might be dark drapery that is in the light, but just dark enough in value to be grouped with a darker value group. In these Ang drawings, he cleverly maximized the impact of his lines by using frontal lighting, so that the lines or the boundaries of forms represent this touch information as well as the shadow at the same time. Notice how when we remove these lines that appeal to our sense of touch, we start to relate to the shapes more optically, and a sense of atmosphere takes over. Conceptual information can actually distract us from our pure visual perceptions of things if we aren't used to considering it on its own. In this example, the block and the handle here are actually the same value, but since there are boundaries in space, we're very likely to overstate these differences. In this Fortuny example, it would be very tempting to make this building a different value than the sky, but these are the relationships that he saw optically, so he noted them down. Despite these examples actually being the same value, our brains really want to make them different. Through painting from life, we can challenge our preconceptions and bring what we learned into imagined work, and even have more creative control when painting from reference or from life. Art is a visual language that works based on contrast of information. Compression allows for this raw contrast information to be turned into the building blocks of design, using grouping to show the big relationships. The language has 4 elements: drawing, values, edges, and color. The elements are dependent on each other, and drawing is the foundational element since it can suggest decisions about all of the other elements.